Welcome back, friends. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're talking about a place that shouldn't exist. A monument built when humans were supposedly too primitive for monuments. A temple before temples were invented. A gathering place erected thousands of years before people learned to farm. This is the story of Göbekli Tepe, a hilltop in Turkey that has forced archaeologists to question everything about the beginning of civilization. Whether you're settling in for sleep or simply seeking calm, you're in the right place. We'll take our time. If you drift off, timestamps are in the description. If this speaks to you, please subscribe and share where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's travel back before written language, before cities, before agriculture itself. Let's visit a hill in southeastern Turkey that defies everything we thought we knew. Stay curious, stay calm. There are countless hills across the Anatolian plateau. For thousands of years, one such hill sat near the village of Öğrençik in southeastern Turkey. Locals called it Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, for its gentle swelling shape. For generations, it was just landscape. Farmers cleared stones from its slopes. Nothing suggested it was anything remarkable. In the early 1960s, an American-Turkish archaeological survey team noted some flint fragments and recorded it as a possible Byzantine cemetery. Then they moved on. That assessment would shape the site's fate for 30 years. At the time, archaeologists expected monuments to come after agriculture, after surplus, after settlement. A hill in rural Turkey didn't fit that pattern. Then, in the mid-1990s, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt came to southeastern Turkey. He'd been working at another site about to be flooded by dam construction. Local people told him about the hill with strange stones. Schmidt later described his realization as almost instantaneous. The limestone fragments showed deliberate carving. The flint tools were from the pre-pottery Neolithic, far older than Byzantine. Within minutes, Schmidt knew he'd found something extraordinary. Excavations began in partnership with the Schanlurfer Museum and German Archaeological Institute. What emerged was beyond imagination. Massive stone pillars, over 15 feet tall, weighing more than 10 tons, arranged in circular enclosures, carved into T-shapes with sophisticated animal reliefs, foxes running, snakes coiling, vultures spreading wings, wild boars frozen mid-stride. The dating was staggering. Approximately 9,600 BCE. More than 11,000 years ago, roughly 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, 7,000 years older than the pyramids. This was before domesticated wheat or barley, before pottery, before tamed sheep or goats. The wheel wouldn't be invented for another 5,000 years. Hunter-gatherers whose most advanced technology was chipped stone, had somehow organized to quarry, transport, carve, and erect monuments rivaling what later agricultural societies would achieve. The discovery shattered assumptions. The progression from hunting to farming to civilization had to be reconsidered. Here was monumental architecture without agriculture, complex organization without settlement, sophisticated art without the food surpluses that were supposed to make such things possible. Klaus Schmidt called Göbekli Tepe a cathedral on a hill, though he was careful to note that the word cathedral carried associations from later religions that didn't necessarily apply. What he meant was that this was clearly a special place, a location where communities gathered for purposes beyond simple survival. News of the discovery spread quickly through archaeological circles, and by the late 1990s, it had captured the public imagination. Headlines proclaimed it the world's first temple, though Schmidt himself was more cautious about such labels. What nobody disputed was that Göbekli Tepe demanded a fundamental rethinking of how complex societies emerge. The old model, farming leads to surplus, surplus leads to settlement, settlement leads to monuments, was clearly incomplete. The hill that had seemed so ordinary, that had been walked past for thousands of years, that had been briefly noted and then dismissed by archaeologists in the 1960s, turned out to hold one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era. And the questions it raised have only multiplied as excavations continue. Who built these stone circles? How did they organize the labor? What beliefs or needs drove them to invest such enormous effort? And perhaps most haunting of all, why was the site deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, sealed beneath tons of earth and rubble as if to hide it from the world? The rediscovery of Göbekli Tepe reminds us that the ground beneath our feet carries memories we haven't yet learned to hear. That sometimes the most profound discoveries come not from seeking the spectacular, but from listening carefully to what seems ordinary. A farmer noticed carved stones in his field. Local people pointed them out to an archaeologist, and a man who had spent years studying the pre-pottery Neolithic recognized what others had missed. History isn't only made by those who build monuments. Sometimes it's revealed by those who pay attention to the stones underfoot. To understand Göbekli Tepe, we must step into the landscape of 11,000 years ago. Between roughly 13,000 and 9,000 years ago, the Near East was in transition. Ice sheets were retreating. Climates warmed, though not smoothly. The Younger Dryas, a sharp cold snap around 12,900 years ago, had disrupted ecosystems. But by the time these stone circles rose, the early Holocene had brought warmth again. Southeastern Anatolia was far greener than today. Oak and pistachio woodlands dotted the landscape. Grasslands grew thick with wild cereals. River valleys ran fuller. The region teemed with life. Enormous gazelle herds migrated seasonally. Wild aurochs, massive, dangerous cattle, grazed open plains. Wild boar roamed woodlands. Red deer moved through valleys. Vultures circled overhead. The people who built Göbekli Tepe lived intimately with these creatures, not as farmers who owned herds, but as hunters who tracked patterns, learned behaviors, studied movements across vast territories. Plant life was equally crucial. Wild einkorn and emmer wheat grew on limestone slopes. Barley appeared in grasslands. People harvested these with flint sickles, ground them on stone querns, made porridge or early flatbreads. This was challenging terrain that demanded knowledge, cooperation, flexibility, but it was also rich enough to support experimentation. Periods of abundance, when groups could gather in larger numbers, stay longer in favored locations, invest labor beyond immediate survival. The Göbekli Tepe Ridge offered particular advantages. It stood at a natural crossroads. To the west stretched the Harran Plain. To the east rose the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. Seasonal streams cut through nearby valleys. Wild cereals grew abundantly on the limestone slopes. Game animals passed through on their migrations. In a landscape of patches, areas of concentrated resources separated by less productive zones, Göbekli Tepe occupied a strategic position. It was a place where multiple resources converged, where paths crossed, where people from different territories might naturally encounter one another. Recent studies suggest that rainfall in this period was higher than today's levels, perhaps by as much as 20 to 30%. The hills would have been greener, springs more numerous, woodland patches more extensive. This created what ecologists call a mosaic environment, a landscape of diverse microhabitats, each offering different resources at different times of year. Such environments favored generalist strategies. People needed to know how to exploit many different food sources, to move flexibly between hunting, gathering nuts, harvesting grains, and fishing. The archaeological term for this is broad-spectrum subsistence, taking advantage of the full spectrum of available resources rather than specializing in just one or two. This flexibility had social implications. To exploit a diverse landscape efficiently, you need more than one family group. You need networks. You need cooperation across larger populations. You need ways to maintain relationships with people you might not see for months at a time. And this is where Göbekli Tepe begins to make sense. In a world of seasonal abundance and periodic scarcity, in a landscape where resources were concentrated but unpredictable, communities needed gathering places, locations where scattered groups could come together during times of plenty, share information, arrange marriages, trade materials, and, critically, reinforce the social bonds that would matter during harder times. The stone circles weren't built despite the fact that people were hunter-gatherers. They were built because of it. Without the option of storing surplus in permanent settlements, without the ability to accumulate resources across generations, mobile communities had to invest in something more portable: relationships. And monuments, paradoxically, could serve that function. They created permanent markers in a mobile landscape, places to return to, reasons to gather. The animals that dominated this world were not distant abstractions. They were daily realities. To hunt aurochs required coordination and courage. These were dangerous beasts that could easily kill a hunter. Tracking gazelle herds meant understanding their patterns across entire seasons, knowing when they would appear and where. Even smaller animals like foxes required knowledge of their habits and habitats. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe reflect this intimacy. The foxes, snakes, vultures, and boars weren't chosen randomly. They were the creatures that shared the landscape, that mattered in daily life, that carried both practical and symbolic weight. As we'll see, these animals would become central to the monument's meaning. But first, we need to understand the practical challenge. How do you build something like Göbekli Tepe without domesticated animals, without metal tools, without wheels? The answer lies in the one resource that was abundant in this landscape of mobile hunter-gatherers: human cooperation. Moving mountains with stone hammers. Look at the pillars standing today. Some tower 15 feet high, some weigh over 20 tons. Quarried, transported, carved, erected, all without metal, wheels, or draft animals. How? Quarries scattered around the site reveal the process. Workers use stone hammers to chip trenches around each pillar, separating it from bedrock. Exhausting, repetitive work. Weeks to complete a single large pillar. Some were never finished, still attached to bedrock today. One abandoned pillar would have exceeded 20 feet and 50 tons. Transportation likely involved wooden sledges and rollers, logs laid as tracks, stones dragged forward, rear logs moved to front. Experiments show 30 to 50 people can move multi-ton blocks this way with coordination and rhythm. The final stage, raising pillars upright. Most likely method, a sloped ramp to the socket, pillar tipped into position using ropes and human force. Once vertical, stabilized with wedged stones. Imagine that moment. The massive stone teetering, dozens straining on ropes, then the satisfying thud as it drops into place. A monument for millennia. This was theatre as much as engineering. The raising would be witnessed, remembered, marking achievement that bound the group together. The technical skill involved shouldn't be underestimated. The T-shaped design of the pillars required careful planning. The sockets in the bedrock had to be precisely sized and positioned. Some pillars have arms carved in low relief on their sides, suggesting they were meant to represent stylized human figures. The T-shape forming head and shoulders, the vertical shaft the body. Creating these forms with stone tools required knowledge passed down across generations. Not everyone could be a master carver. The skill level varied. Some carvings are crude, others remarkably sophisticated. This suggests a community with specialists, people who devoted significant time to perfecting their craft. The tools themselves tell a story. Thousands of stone hammers have been recovered from Göbekli Tepe, many showing wear from heavy use. They range from small handheld pieces for detail work to massive hammerstone weighing several kilograms for rough quarrying. Flint tools were used for finer carving. And while flint can be incredibly sharp, sharper than modern surgical steel in some cases, it's also brittle. Tools break. They need constant maintenance and replacement. The sheer volume of broken flint at the site speaks to the scale of work invested. Some materials had to come from far away. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its sharpness, appears in small quantities at Göbekli Tepe. The nearest sources are in central or eastern Anatolia, hundreds of kilometers away. This tells us the builders were connected to long-distance exchange networks, trading or traveling to acquire specialized materials. But the overwhelming majority of work was done with local limestone and local tools, powered entirely by human muscle and ingenuity. When we consider the organizational implications, the true significance becomes clear. This wasn't a project one extended family could accomplish. It required coordination across multiple groups, probably numbering in the hundreds. People had to be gathered, fed, and housed during construction periods. Tasks had to be divided. Quarrying teams, transport teams, carving specialists, provisioners. Someone had to make decisions about design, about when to work and when to rest, about how to resolve the inevitable disputes that arise when large groups labor together. Yet the archaeological evidence doesn't show the kind of hierarchical society we might expect. There are no palaces, no obvious elite burials. In fact, very few burials of any kind at Göbekli Tepe itself. No massive storage facilities suggesting centralized control of food surplus. This raises fascinating questions about alternative forms of social organization. Perhaps leadership was temporary, situational, based on expertise rather than permanent authority. Perhaps decisions were made communally, through councils or consensus. Perhaps the very act of building created its own authority structure that dissolved when construction ended. We simply don't know. What we can say is that mobile hunter-gatherers found ways to organize complex, sustained projects without the institutional structures we associate with states or chiefdoms. The pillars themselves stand as evidence. Communities can build monuments through cooperation rather than coercion, through shared purpose rather than centralized power. And when we look at what they chose to carve into these monuments, we begin to glimpse what that shared purpose might have been. Walk into one of the great enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, and you're surrounded by eyes, fox eyes, snake eyes, the blank, eternal gaze of vultures, dozens of animals carved into the limestone pillars, their forms captured with remarkable attention to detail. These carvings are the site's most immediately striking feature. They're what appear in documentaries and museum displays, but they're also the most mysterious. What did these animals mean to the people who carved them? Foxes appear again and again, small, graceful, running in profile along the sides of pillars or leaping across their faces. In the ecology of the region, foxes were opportunistic scavengers, clever survivors who lived at the edges of human camps. They embodied a kind of cunning adaptability that might have been admired or feared, or both. Snakes are even more prominent. They appear in great profusion, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, coiling down the faces of pillars in sinuous relief. The region was home to various snake species, including venomous ones. Encounters would have been regular and potentially deadly, but snakes also shed their skin, a visible transformation that many cultures have interpreted as renewal or rebirth. For people living so close to the cycles of nature, this quality might have carried profound symbolic weight. Vultures spread their wings across several pillars, sometimes depicted alongside headless human figures. This association is intriguing. At later sites in the Near East, we have evidence of excarnation practices, deliberately exposing bodies to birds of prey to remove the flesh before burying the bones. The vulture imagery at Göbekli Tepe might hint at similar beliefs about death and transformation, though we have no direct evidence of such practices at the site itself. Wild boar appear in strength and aggression. These were dangerous animals to hunt, but their meat and fat made them valuable prey. A large boar could feed many people. The detailed depictions suggest both respect for their power and celebration of successful hunts. Other creatures appear less frequently, but with equal care. Wild cattle, deer, spiders, scorpions, waterfowl. The bestiary is diverse, drawn from the full range of animals that inhabited the region. What's telling is what doesn't appear. There are almost no domesticated animals in the carvings. No sheep, no goats, no dogs. At least not in forms that suggest domestication. This makes sense chronologically. The site was built before animal domestication had taken hold in the region. But it also tells us something about the worldview being expressed. This was a monument to the wild, to the creatures that shared the landscape but remained beyond human control, to forces that were powerful, dangerous, and worthy of representation. The style of carving varies. Some animals are rendered in high relief, their forms almost three-dimensional, standing proud from the stone surface. Others are incised more simply, outlines that suggest rather than depict. This variation might reflect different hands, different time periods, or different levels of importance. In some cases, multiple species appear on a single pillar, creating composite scenes. A fox runs beneath a vulture. Snakes intertwine with water birds. These combinations might represent actual ecological relationships, or they might carry symbolic meanings we can't reconstruct. The most intriguing carvings are the most abstract. Some pillars bear geometric patterns, H shapes, crescents, lines and dots arranged in ways that seem deliberate, but whose meaning eludes us. Are these early attempts at notation? Calendrical markers? Pure decoration? We don't know. What we can say is that the people who created these carvings possessed sophisticated observational skills. The animals are anatomically accurate. A zoologist could identify species from the carvings alone. This suggests artists who spent considerable time studying their subjects, who knew how foxes moved, how snakes coiled, how vultures spread their wings. But observation alone doesn't explain why these particular animals were chosen. Out of all the species in the environment, why these? Why in such abundance? One possibility is that they carried totemic significance. Many hunter-gatherer societies recognize special relationships between human groups and particular animals. Clans or lineages might identify with specific creatures, seeing them as emblems of their identity. The proliferation of foxes, snakes, and vultures might reflect different groups claiming space within the enclosures, marking their presence through their chosen animals. Another possibility is more directly ecological. These are creatures that would have been encountered regularly, that posed challenges or opportunities, that structured daily life. To carve them into enduring stone might have been a way of acknowledging their importance, of fixing them in a permanent form, even as the animals themselves remained wild and unpredictable. A third possibility is ritual. The animals might represent forces or spirits, aspects of a worldview in which the boundary between animal and supernatural was fluid. The enclosures might have been places where people sought to engage with these forces through ceremony, through storytelling, through acts we can no longer fully reconstruct. Probably all of these explanations contain elements of truth. The carvings were likely multivalent, carrying practical, social, and spiritual meanings simultaneously. What's certain is that the act of carving mattered. It required time, skill, and shared agreement about what deserved representation. Every strike of a stone tool against limestone was a choice, an investment, a statement about what was important enough to preserve. And when we step back and consider the enclosures as complete environments, stone circles ringed with carved pillars, creating spaces surrounded by animal imagery, we begin to sense how powerful the experience must have been. To enter these enclosures was to be surrounded by the creatures that defined the world. To gather there was to occupy a space where wild and human met, where the forces beyond control were acknowledged and perhaps negotiated with. The monuments weren't just architecture. They were stages for encounters with meaning. Beyond the pillars, the infrastructure of gathering. While the carved pillars capture our imagination, they represent only one part of what made Göbekli Tepe function. Hidden in the archaeological record, in the unglamorous finds that don't make headlines, is evidence of the practical systems that sustained the site's use over centuries. Consider water. The limestone ridge where Göbekli Tepe sits has no natural spring. No permanent stream runs nearby, yet large gatherings require significant water supplies. How did people manage this? Archaeologists have documented carved channels in the bedrock, deliberate grooves that guided rainwater toward collection points. Some of these channels feed into deep basins cut directly into the limestone, creating natural cisterns that could store water for extended periods. One such basin, located on the northwestern edge of the mound, measures roughly 8 meters in diameter and 3 meters deep. Its capacity would have been enormous, enough to support not just daily drinking needs, but also food preparation, cleaning, and possibly ritual uses. The presence of stone slabs that appear to have covered some channels suggests people understood the importance of keeping stored water clean and preventing evaporation. This is practical knowledge born from necessity, but it's also engineering that required planning and community agreement. Food preparation left equally telling traces. Grinding stones appear throughout the site in remarkable numbers. Some are small, handstones, for individual use. Others are large querns with deep basins worn smooth by thousands of grinding sessions. The sheer abundance suggests food processing at scale. Wild cereals gathered from the surrounding slopes would have been brought to the site and ground into flour for porridge or early breads. This was labor-intensive work, primarily done by women in most hunter-gatherer societies, and it would have taken hours each day to produce enough food for large gatherings. Storage was another challenge. Large limestone basins appear in several contexts, some so heavy they must have been carved in place rather than transported. Residue analysis on some of these vessels has revealed traces of lipids consistent with fermented beverages, perhaps early beer-like drinks made from wild barley. The possibility of ritual feasting with fermented drinks adds another dimension to our understanding of the site. Beer, even in rudimentary form, has social power. It alters consciousness, facilitates bonding, marks occasions as special. If people were gathering at Göbekli Tepe partly for communal feasts, lubricated by fermented drinks, it helps explain both the site's attraction and the labor invested in maintaining it. The animal bones tell their own story of provisioning. Gazelle remains dominate the assemblages, often bearing cut marks and evidence of systematic butchering. Some accumulations suggest mass processing events, perhaps entire herds driven into ambushes during seasonal migrations, then butchered and distributed among gathered groups. Wild boar bones appear frequently, their tusk marks distinguishing them from later domesticated pigs. Aurochs bones, though less common, represent enormous quantities of meat when they do appear. Red deer, waterfowl, and smaller game fill out the picture. This wasn't subsistence hunting. The scale suggests feasting, periodic events where meat was abundant, where sharing created and reinforced social bonds, where the act of eating together was as important as the calories consumed. Tool production also happened on site. Thousands of flint flakes litter the ground, the debris of continuous tool making. People were napping new blades to replace broken ones, resharpening dulled edges, creating the everyday implements needed for cutting meat, scraping hides, working wood. Obsidian tools, though rarer, point to long-distance connections. The nearest sources are hundreds of kilometers away in volcanic regions of central Anatolia. Either people traveled immense distances to acquire this prized material, or exchange networks linked Göbekli Tepe to far-flung communities. Beads provide another glimpse into the social life of the site. Tiny perforated stones, carefully shaped and polished, appear in modest numbers. These would have been strung into necklaces or sewn onto clothing, portable markers of identity, status, or affiliation. Their presence reminds us that Even without writing, people were communicating complex social information through material culture. What emerges from all these humble finds is a picture of sustained, organized activity. Göbekli Tepe wasn't used for a single generation and abandoned. It was maintained, modified, and returned to across centuries. The infrastructure, water systems, grinding areas, tool-making stations represents cumulative investments by communities who expect it to come back. This raises questions about the rhythm of use. Was the site occupied year-round by a small caretaker group? Or was it used seasonally, with intensive periods of activity alternating with months of abandonment? The evidence leans toward the latter. The sheer scale of food remains suggests periodic large gatherings rather than continuous, small-scale occupation. The absence of year-round domestic features, substantial middens, dense storage areas, extensive hearths, points against permanent residence. Perhaps the pattern was something like this. For most of the year, the hilltop sat quiet, tended by a handful of people who maintained the enclosures and prepared for the next gathering. Then, during specific seasons, perhaps tied to gazelle migrations or wild cereal harvests, groups would converge from across the region. The population would swell to hundreds. Feasts would be held, pillars carved or raised, rituals performed, marriages arranged, stories shared. After days or weeks, the gathering would dissolve. People would return to their territories, carrying with them renewed relationships and shared memories of time spent in the circles of stone. The monument itself served as the anchor, permanent while the community remained mobile, a fixed point in a fluid landscape. And when we consider this pattern, the deliberate burial of the site becomes even more poignant. Around 8000 BCE, something changed. After centuries, perhaps over a millennium of use, the people who had maintained Göbekli Tepe made a decision. They began to fill in the great enclosures. This wasn't abandonment. It wasn't destruction by enemies. It wasn't the slow decay of a place no longer cared for. It was deliberate, systematic burial. Tons of limestone rubble, broken tools, animal bones and sediment were carried to the enclosures and poured in until the towering pillars disappeared from view. The fill came from many sources: quarry debris, midden material, even fragments of earlier pillars that had been broken up. It was as if the entire accumulated history of the site was being folded back into itself. The labor required would have been immense. If building the enclosures demanded cooperation, so did burying them. This was a community project, a shared act that must have carried profound meaning. But why? Archaeologists have proposed several explanations, each with strengths and uncertainties. One possibility is ritual closure. Just as some cultures ceremonially kill objects by breaking them before burial, perhaps the enclosures needed to be sealed once their active life ended. The burial could have been an offering, a way of giving back to the earth what had been shaped from it. The fill, rich with the debris of countless gatherings, might have been seen as appropriate, embedding the memory of activity into the monument itself. Another explanation is practical. As enclosures aged, pillars cracked or leaned, maintenance might have become burdensome. Rather than allow sacred spaces to fall into disrepair, communities might have chosen to bury them respectfully and create new enclosures nearby. The fill would stabilize the hill, creating a foundation for future construction. A third possibility involves broader social transformation. By 8000 BCE, the world was changing. Agriculture was spreading through the Fertile Crescent. People were domesticating plants and animals, settling into permanent villages, developing new forms of social organization. The way of life that had sustained Göbekli Tepe, mobile hunter-gatherers gathering periodically for communal projects, was giving way to something different. Perhaps the burial marked recognition that an era was ending, that the monument belonged to a world that was fading. The timing is suggestive. As the great enclosures were being filled, nearby regions saw the establishment of permanent farming villages. Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest Neolithic towns, was founded only a few centuries later. The stone circles of Göbekli Tepe and the densely packed houses of Çatalhöyük represent different worlds, different ways of organizing human life. Maybe the people who filled the enclosures understood they stood at a threshold. The stones that had anchored a mobile existence might have seemed less relevant, even problematic, for communities settling into permanent places. Better to bury them with honor than let them decay into irrelevance. Whatever the reasons, the act of burial preserved the site for modern discovery. Without the protective layer of fill, exposure to weather and human activity over 11,000 years would have degraded the carvings beyond recognition. The decision to bury ensured that the stones would survive. There's a beautiful irony in this. The same communities that made Göbekli Tepe invisible to their descendants made it possible for us to see it today. The burial wasn't the absolute end. Some areas continued to be used for a time, with later, smaller structures built above the filled enclosures. But the monumental phase was over. The tradition of raising massive T-shaped pillars and carving them with elaborate animal imagery ceased. The supernova, to use Klaus Schmidt's metaphor, had burned out. So what do we make of Göbekli Tepe now, decades after its rediscovery? It has fundamentally changed how we think about the origins of complex society. The old model, agriculture, creates surplus. Surplus enables specialists. Specialists build monuments. Clearly needs revision. Göbekli Tepe shows that monumental architecture can precede agriculture. That complex social organization can emerge among mobile communities. That profound symbolic expression doesn't require writing, cities, or states. It suggests that the drivers of social complexity are more varied than we assumed. Perhaps it wasn't agriculture that sparked civilization, but rather the need for communities to gather, to reinforce bonds, to negotiate increasingly complex social relationships. Perhaps monuments came before farms because people needed gathering places before they needed fields. The site also reminds us of the danger of linear narratives. History doesn't unfold in neat stages from simple to complex. The people of Göbekli Tepe were sophisticated in ways that later agricultural societies sometimes were not. They built monuments that wouldn't be matched in scale for thousands of years. Then they stopped. Their tradition ended. This should humble us. Progress isn't inevitable. Complexity can emerge and then dissolve. Traditions can flower brilliantly and then disappear. Göbekli Tepe was not the beginning of civilization. It was one experiment among many, one response to particular conditions, one community's answer to the question of how to live together. Its legacy lies not in direct continuity, but in what it reveals about human possibility, about what people can achieve through cooperation, about the power of shared symbols. about the deep antiquity of our need to create meaning through monuments. When we stand among the stone circles today, sheltered under the protective roofs built to preserve them, we're touching something that transcends facts and dates. We're encountering the work of people whose names we'll never know, whose language is lost, whose daily lives remain opaque. But their work endures. The foxes still run, the snakes still coil, the vultures still spread their wings across limestone faces, and we, 11,000 years later, still gather to try to understand what they meant. Perhaps that's the truest legacy of Göbekli Tepe. Not the specific beliefs or practices, which remain mysterious, but the simple fact that humans have always reached beyond survival, have always sought to create something that lasts, have always tried to embed a meaning in the world. The monument that shouldn't exist according to our old models does exist, and in existing, it asks us to reconsider not just the past, but our assumptions about what humans are capable of when they work together. Thank you for spending this time with me, for slowing down, for letting this story unfold at its own pace. If these quiet explorations of history speak to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and share with others who might appreciate them. Tell me in the comments, what strikes you most about Göbekli Tepe? What questions does it raise for you? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.